Good evening. My name is Steve Barbato, and I'll be presenting to you my capstone study for Western Governors University on conducting curriculum revision to increase student reading proficiency in secondary ELA classrooms using student choice. This is for the degree program for Curriculum and Instruction, Master's of Science. The research topic overview. First thing I wanted to do is define what makes for a strong curriculum. Strong curriculum means that it provides unique opportunities for learning, access to diverse types of literary and informational texts, so that students can make fruitful connections to the world that exists outside of the classroom. The curriculum, of course, is the apparatus from which teaching and learning can be produced. And in this case, the overview provides a downward trend in fluency and reading performance on learning standards related to literary and informational text. Now, this was an issue that had existed for many years before this capstone study had began, and it made me question whether there was some low student interest and motivation with the curriculum, which is part of the reason that the study was developed. In recognizing the way the classroom was instructed, there was a lot of teacher-centeredness that was going on in the classroom, and there was a lot of lack of flexibility and choice that were evident in that downward trend in fluency. The problem was exacerbated, obviously, by the COVID-19 pandemic, and in the spring of 2020, the effect of the pandemic had created the poorest student record of performance to date, based on the end-of-year results of the 2020 school year. I've been teaching at the school district for 16 years, and the failure rate and inability rate for students to complete the work was at unprecedentedly low levels. Some of the variables that affected that were the inconsistent approaches to learning, being that the students, at some points were doing distance or virtual learning. Sometimes they were synchronous, sometimes they were asynchronous. There was hybrid settings. There was very diverse population of students that were in different learning platforms. So it was kind of hard to have a uniform teaching style. The students were kind of forced into virtual learning, had a lack of familiarity with a lot of digital learning platforms that were implemented during this time. There was lack of professional development for the teachers, so there was a lot of difficulty in terms of being able to teach the students how to use the platforms. And then, of course, there was an inaccessibility to curricular content. Certainly, the students being placed in virtual learning cohorts away from the school took away their ability to use a lot of the curricular assets they would normally have in a traditional classroom setting. The result of this in the spring was obviously universal frustration, both on the students' part and the teachers' part, as well as the rest of the stakeholders in education. The result was a profoundly poor academic performance by the students overall. In some cases, there was an incomplete performance, meaning students had only partially completed the work or partially completed or demonstrated proficiency on the learning standards related to literature and informational text. It resulted in the district having to amend proficiency scores to, basically curving them in a sense to give students a better opportunity to pass and reach the requirements for graduation in some cases. There was the elimination of summative and culminating assessment, meaning there were no final exams. There was no end of year projects or anything like that, since there wasn't any consistent approach to teaching and learning at the end of the 2020 school year. As I mentioned before, a lot of final grades were curved, adding a element of social promotion rather than students just showing enough proficiency to be able to move on to the next grade level or graduation. The result continued in the fall of 2020, in the following school year. The incomplete and poor performance of the students kind of continued, and that poor performance was seemingly rewarded the year before. Students had, not really done their best and had their grades adjusted and inflated so that they could either pass or be promoted. And that basically led to a poor work ethic and poor performance in the fall of 2020. Likewise, in the fall of 2020, there was a digital inequality that kind of existed. Some students had better access to Wi-Fi and resources than others. Not all students had equitable means of working digitally, having to share laptops and resources as opposed to having their own devices to work from. Kind of added some complexity to making sure the kids had the resources they need to succeed. A lack of reflexive, agile, and adaptable practice and response was something that Seymour and others had kind of pointed out in their study, but it was something that was certainly being practiced in our school district as well. The rigidity of the curriculum and the lack of flexibility, the lack of student choice, kind of prevented teachers and students from working cohesively, really causing a lot of students to kind of become frustrated and shut down. There was an inconsistent learning environment even at the beginning of 2020. All students kind of started the year virtually, but not all students had access to the same type of technology as I mentioned before. So there was an inequality or inability to reach all the students consistently. Some students were cohorted. Some students were, learning synchronously. Some were learning asynchronously, and obviously all students were kind of struggling in that capacity. Our school traditionally does a rotating drop block schedule where the students have four classes that rotate in the morning, four that rotate in the afternoon, and it was replaced by an 8-period day that went from approximately 8 o'clock to 12:30, as opposed to 7:30 to 2:30 like the normal day schedule. Most kids ended up or had the option to join a hybrid or cohort upon their return to school. Some students, unfortunately, due to illness or quarantining, could not attend school. Others, parents had opted to keep their children home. So, although some kids did return to school in the fall of 2020 after the whole school started virtual, not everybody made it back. So, there was an inconsistent approach to learning and pedagogy in the beginning of the year. The research problem, obviously, was that students were performing very poorly and inconsistently on the assessments, particularly those aligned to literary and informational text. Making connections to real world context outside of the classroom, as I mentioned before, is one of the staples of making sense of literature and informational text. Students being able to connect texts to other texts, text themselves, making some relevant, making what they're reading relevant to them, and of course, making connections to the world around them was likewise important. The problem stemmed from a lack of accessibility and interest in a literary and informational text. And this was something that I pointed out earlier that I hypothesized even before the COVID-19 pandemic that the rigidity of the curriculum, the traditional British canon that the students were learning from, were all kind of inhibitive factors to motivating the students to complete the work when they were forced to be independent. Additionally, a lack of digital resources and assessments. So many of the assessments that were, designed in the current curriculum were based off of traditional classroom instruction, in-person learning, having access to a photocopy machine, things like that. Students, when they were on virtual, did not have access to the same types of resources and assessments, and they weren't very easily translated virtually. So that was something that was creating an inhibition for learning. Additional research problem information was a lack of training and implementation of virtual learning platforms from the teachers. Obviously, being forced into virtual learning in short notice and having to kind of build the plane as we're flying it, so to speak, led to a lot of inconsistent performance from teachers and their pedagogical practices, as well as student performance and their academic performance. Problem, like I said, existed before the pandemic, but certainly the pandemic kind of exacerbated the problem. Because the problem existed before the pandemic and was exacerbated during the pandemic, it led me to think of some research questions about how to explore the inconsistent approach and the poor performance on literary standards related to both reading literature and informational text. So the question therefore became, was there a problem with the existing curriculum already? And certainly I had initial feelings about the curriculum and its rigidity and its lack of flexibility, its lack of student choice, its traditional literary canon were all inhibitions that students had complained about in the past. And certainly my experience with the curriculum and realizing that a lot of it was not relevant to a 21st century audience kind of lent itself to the problem that was being created, or at least the hypothesis for the problem that was being created. Student boredom and disengagement was certainly something that was evident as well. And certainly, student boredom and disengagement affects their reading fluency and performance. The more invested in something that the student is reading, the more likely they are to demonstrate better proficiency on what they're reading, especially with literary and informational text. And certainly, the trend was kind of trending downward in the last couple of years and was exacerbated awfully by what happened at the pandemic. Certainly, this has an effect on social and emotional health. Students had enough variables to worry about with the pandemic happening around them, affecting their social and emotional health. Signs of disengagement and boredom were kind of exacerbated by the pandemic, but certainly existed beforehand. Evaluation of curricular content and looking at it very briefly, very generally before I actually did a curriculum evaluation, it was very obvious that a lot of the resources that I'd used in the past were not accessible to students, especially ones that were on virtual learning cohorts. So it became important to try to find a means to make those connections. There were rigid learning platforms, mostly traditionally centered. that were around traditional British literary canon. So it was important to kind of find some digital platforms and see if the curriculum had some digital platforms children could learn from. Text-driven assessment. So much of what was in the curriculum was driven by the texts themselves, all the assessments, etc., rather than being, driven by the standards. The books kind of were creating an inhibition for that. And then obviously the teacher-centeredness in the curriculum certainly took away from, a wider, more broad experience for students who have a better opportunity to create relevant connections to what they're reading when the teacher had so much choice in what was being assessed and what was being assigned. That teacher-centeredness kind of created a narrow approach to learning. So the research questions that were devised for the study, number one, how does the 11th grade ELA curriculum at the Researchers High School align with the New Jersey State rubric for curriculum evaluation? And then as well, number two, how might the 11th grade curriculum be adjusted to align the New Jersey State rubric for more evaluation, for curriculum evaluation, and to improve student performance on reading standards for literary and informational texts? So the idea here was kind of, my hypothesis was that, the students were kind of struggling with the curriculum because the curriculum might not have been uh, up to date, might not have been aligned with the New Jersey State rubric for curriculum evaluation, and as well as finding some ways or suggestions, improvements to improve the students' proficiency on reading literary texts and informational texts. Justification and purpose of this research, first and foremost, is to kind of triangulate some of the variables that were inhibiting student competency. We talked about the pandemic playing a role in that, but certainly the problem existed before the pandemic. So certainly taking a look at the curriculum and doing a formal evaluation of the curriculum would be one way to kind of see what kind of variables were kind of inhibiting that competency. Looking at the curriculum evaluation, specific elements to look at, obviously, literary and informational text, looking at the different learning platforms that are available to the students, the resources that are being made available to them so they can learn the material and retain the material, and then certainly the accessibility they have to the content. Certainly if they, don't have accessibility to not only the reading text, but the resource to go along with them, it's going to make learning very difficult. The other part of the purpose was for recommendations for adjustments. Obviously, we want to try to improve reading proficiency with literary and informational text. We want to increase the accessibility to the content so that students have access to the materials that they're working from. And then, of course, we want to make the curriculum more student-centered. Certainly, that's going to broaden the perspective of what they're learning as opposed to creating that narrow perspective when it's so teacher-centered. Data collection instruments. I used a lot of data collection instruments here. First of all, the first data collection instrument that we worked from was actually the existing curriculum. And the curriculum, as we know, is the apparatus from which the curricular instruction is deduced and designed. And the curriculum itself was aligned to New Jersey core content standards. So certainly it kind of fit the criteria in that case. It also features a robust traditional British literary and informational canon. So it was, very heavy in traditional British literature, as well as literary criticisms about the British literature in a very traditional way. Data collection instrument number two was the CCSS Implementation Curriculum Evaluation Tool from the state of New Jersey. This tool was kind of used to inform the evaluation tool that was created, the product that was created for this research study. It was created based off of the rubric that was put together by New Jersey State Department of Education. It uses qualitative components to determine criteria for effective curriculum. It's categorized using coding from grounded theory, which is something that was used part of the evaluation tool that I used. And it certainly influenced the qualitative data collection using the other instruments that were provided during the study. You click on the document here. The document brings up the full curriculum evaluation tool that was used to inform. Obviously, you can see the tool is broken up into categories. Like I said, coding was used in evaluating the district rubric in order to see if it fits the criteria that were outlined for the evaluation tool used for this project. Another data collection instrument I used this time was a quantitative one. And this was a Linkit Test 3 Form A. And this was essentially a baseline assessment that was used for students to establish their reading fluency level both with literary text and informational text. This document was used to kind of determine proficiency groups in the beginning of the year based off of the quantitative data that was gathered from this. Essentially, the tool here, and I'll share it with you guys here. A tool itself is a multiple choice assessment that provides different samples and context from both informational text and literary text. And the students got a series of multiple choice questions they had to answer based off of the passages that they were reading in order to make connections. Some of the questions were blended, other questions featured questions that were directly about the document. Either way, the students had a diagnostic type assessment in the beginning of September to kind of establish a baseline for their reading fluency and proficiency at the beginning of the school year. Throughout the course of the school year, I gave the kids several surveys. This was during the 2021 school year. So all this data is all archived data that was accessed um, for this research study after the fact. But I maintained survey data throughout the year because we were running a lot of piloted programs based on the nature of the unique school year that we have. This particular document or instrument was a survey that was used in the first unit to ascertain the student interest and kind of corroborate the proficiency groups that were kind of created. Got to get a sense of the types of learning styles that the kids have, and evaluated the different learning platforms they're familiar with, their familiarity with digital assessment and which digital assessment tools they enjoyed the most, the type of texts and resources that they're used to, as well as their accessibility to the curriculum. So click on the document here. Likewise, you can see the survey was done in Google Forms, and it was one that was shared with the students electronically. It was done with Likert scales so that the kids would have an idea about identifying, different versions of books that they enjoy reading. As we scroll through here, asking them about the propensity to complete work in a unit. And again, most of these were all based off of Likert scale choices. So the nominal data here was used to kind of inform and corroborate a lot of what the diagnostic assessment, the Linked Test 3 Form A that I was talking about before. Using the gradebook from the 2021 school year, and a lot of the data that came in the gradebook was a way to kind of really take a lot of qualitative data to demonstrate the growth that the students would have in using these various platforms and modifications that were going to be made for the curriculum. All the averages that I have as part of this data here are based off of reading literature and informational text, which is the stem of the research question I was trying to answer to kind of get a sense of the proficiency levels that students had throughout the year. First marking period, um, like it says here, all the content was nearly all teacher choice. It was teacher centered, and the students were in virtual learning. So there was a lot of accessibility issues in terms of the content, resources, books and literature the kids were working from, because a lot of the tools and resources that were being used were set up for a traditional classroom setting, as opposed to a virtual setting, which is where the students were working from. As we eased into marking periods 2 and 3, students gradually returned to school and they received a little bit more choice throughout the year, a little bit more independence in terms of how they wanted to learn, what they wanted to learn. They got to pick some books and assessments along the way. And the kids were placed in virtual and hybrid cohorts. So, for the most part, I'd say about 1/3 of the student body had returned to school at this point. And by the end of marking period 3, about half the students had returned, with the rest of the students remaining on a virtual cohort the entire school year. By the time I got to the fourth marking period, all the units were completely student choice and student centered. I'll talk more later on about the curriculum plan that the students built for themselves. And like I said, it was predominantly in person and hybrid learning. The majority of the kids had returned to school by the end of the fourth marking period, and certainly made for being able to make connections a little bit better. And looking at the document here with the data for the marking period averages, uh, that's not coming up there. I'll have to fix that. But we'll move on to the next document here. Uh, Test 3, Form B, was another quantitative assessment. This is very similar to Form A that was given in September, except this one was given in February, about halfway through the year. This was used as a benchmark assessment for progression to kind of see how the students were developing with their fluency in both informational and literary texts. So this was given at the end of the second marking period, the second unit, and was kind of used to corroborate some adjustments that were made to the curriculum during its implementation the first half of the year. If we click on this document here, we can see that it's set up very similarly to the document that we were looking at before, Form A, We have a series of multiple choice questions based off of reading passages. There are 5 different sections that the students had to read from or choose from, and they had multiple choice questions that they answered 30 of them altogether.